Welcome to Nation Scope, where power, history, and hidden turning points collide. Two nations born from bloodshed, driven by pride, and locked in rivalry for over a century somehow became the closest allies on Earth. This is not a story of instant friendship. It's a slow, dangerous transformation shaped by war scares, ego, economics, and a few moments where everything almost went wrong. When did Britain and America stop being enemies? The answer is more dramatic than you think. The relationship between Britain and America did not begin as a rivalry, it began as ownership. For over a century before independence, Britain did not see America as a future equal or partner, but as a set of profitable colonies. Tobacco from Virginia, sugar from the Caribbean, timber from New England, these were not symbols of shared identity, but assets feeding the British Empire. The American colonists, meanwhile, were British subjects who sang British songs, fought in British wars, and prayed for British kings. And yet, beneath that shared surface, resentment was quietly fermenting. The 7 Years' War, known in America as the French and Indian War, changed everything. Britain emerged victorious but broke. To pay its debts, Parliament turned to the colonies, taxing them directly for the first time. To Britain this was logical. To many colonists it was betrayal. They had fought and bled as Britons, yet now they were treated as expendable revenue streams without representation. The slogan, "No taxation without representation," was not just rhetoric. It was a declaration that the emotional bond between colony and crown was cracking. By 1776, the crack became a rupture. The American Declaration of Independence was not simply a request for separation. It was a public indictment of King George III. In British eyes it was treason. In American eyes it was liberation. The Revolutionary War that followed was brutal, humiliating, and deeply personal. Britain did not just lose territory, it lost prestige. Losing to a group of colonies challenged the myth of imperial invincibility. For Americans, victory did not bring closure. It brought suspicion. Peace in 1783 ended the war, but not the hostility. Britain still viewed the United States as an upstart experiment likely to fail. American leaders, in turn, feared Britain would try to reclaim its former colonies. British troops lingered in forts on American soil. British ships interfered with American trade. British officers impressed American sailors into the Royal Navy, treating them as runaway subjects rather than citizens of a sovereign nation. Independence existed on paper, but respect did not. This unresolved tension exploded again in 1812. The War of 1812 is often misunderstood as a minor conflict, but at the time, it was existential. The United States believed Britain was deliberately strangling its economy and violating its sovereignty. Britain, locked in a life-or-death struggle with Napoleon, saw America as an annoyance at best and a potential threat at worst. When war was declared, neither side expected the chaos that followed. British troops burned Washington, D.C., torching the Capitol and the White House. For Americans, it was a national trauma, proof that the old empire still saw them as inferior. For Britain, it was a message: you may be independent, but you are not untouchable. Yet even this war ended inconclusively. No territory changed hands. No decisive victory was claimed. And strangely, that stalemate mattered. The Treaty of Ghent in 1814 did something unexpected. It closed the book on revenge. Britain had bigger priorities. America had survived another imperial test. For the first time, both sides began to realize that endless hostility was costly and unproductive. But make no mistake, this was not friendship. It was exhaustion. What followed was not peace built on trust, but on calculation. Britain slowly shifted its global focus. America slowly expanded westward. The two nations avoided war, but suspicion lingered like smoke after a fire. Each watched the other carefully, waiting for weakness, preparing for the possibility that the next conflict would not end in a draw. And then, as the 19th century progressed, something subtle but powerful began to change. Something that would redefine their relationship forever. Not a treaty. Not an apology. But a realization that the world itself was changing, and old enemies might soon need each other. By the early 1800s, Britain and the United States were no longer actively fighting, but they were far from reconciled. The peace that followed the War of 1812 was uneasy, defined less by goodwill and more by restraint. Both nations understood that another war would be disastrous, yet neither trusted the other enough to relax. What followed was one of the most dangerous phases of their relationship. A prolonged rivalry where war felt possible at almost any moment, but never quite arrived. The first major test came not in Europe, but in North America itself. The British Empire still ruled Canada, and to many Americans, Canada looked like unfinished business. Some U.S. politicians openly believed that Canada would eventually fall into American hands, either through war or sheer demographic pressure. Britain knew this. Canadian defense became a strategic priority, and British officials quietly planned for the possibility of another American invasion. The border between the two nations became one of the most militarized frontiers in the world. Yet something remarkable happened during this period. Instead of escalating disputes into open conflict, both sides began choosing diplomacy over gunfire. This was not idealism, it was necessity. Britain was managing a globe-spanning empire. America was still consolidating its identity and expanding westward. War with each other would drain resources neither could spare. The Rush-Bagot Agreement of 1817 symbolized this shift. It dramatically reduced naval forces on the Great Lakes, effectively demilitarizing the border. This decision was revolutionary for its time. Former enemies voluntarily disarmed along a shared frontier stretching thousands of miles. It was not friendship, but it was trust in its earliest, most fragile form. Still, tensions continued to simmer. Trade disputes flared regularly. British merchants worried about American competition. American politicians accused Britain of economic manipulation. And then there was the issue of slavery. Britain abolished slavery across its empire in 1833, while the United States remained deeply divided on the issue. This moral divide added a new layer of tension, particularly as enslaved people escaped from the U.S. into British-controlled Canada, where they were granted freedom. Southern American leaders were furious. Britain refused to return them. The most dangerous confrontation of this era came in 1845, during the Oregon boundary dispute. Both nations claimed vast territory in the Pacific Northwest. American expansionists rallied behind the slogan 54-40 or fight, demanding the entire region up to latitude 54 degrees 40 minutes. Britain had military forces in the area and could have chosen war. Instead, once again, compromise prevailed. The Oregon Treaty of 1846 split the territory along the 49th parallel, avoiding bloodshed. This moment matters because it revealed a pattern. Britain and America were learning how to disagree without fighting. Each peaceful resolution reinforced the idea that war between them was not inevitable. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, a shared habit of negotiation replaced the reflex of hostility. But peace did not mean alignment. When the American Civil War erupted in 1861, Britain watched closely, calculating where its interests lay. Officially neutral, Britain leaned dangerously close to supporting the Confederacy. Southern cotton fueled British textile mills, and many British elites viewed the divided United States as proof that Republican democracy was flawed. American leaders knew this. The fear that Britain might intervene on behalf of the Confederacy haunted Washington. The Trent Affair nearly triggered war. In 1861, a U.S. warship intercepted a British mail ship and seized 2 Confederate diplomats. Britain erupted in outrage. Troops were sent to Canada. War plans were drawn. For weeks, it seemed inevitable that Britain and the United States would be fighting once again. Then, something unprecedented happened. The U.S. government backed down. The diplomats were released. An apology, carefully worded but unmistakable, was issued. Britain stood down its forces. War was avoided, not through intimidation but through concession. This moment marked a quiet turning point. For the first time, the United States had chosen to preserve peace with Britain even at the cost of appearing weak. For Britain, it was proof that America was no longer a reckless former colony, but a state capable of restraint. Mutual respect, once absent, began to emerge. By the end of the Civil War, the foundation of hostility that had defined the Anglo-American relationship for nearly a century was visibly eroding. They were still rivals. They still mistrusted each other. But they were no longer instinctive enemies. What neither nation fully understood yet was that a new global order was forming, one that would soon force them to decide whether they would remain competitors, or become something far more powerful together. By the late 19th century, the world Britain had dominated for generations was beginning to change, and Britain knew it. The United States, once dismissed as a rebellious experiment, was no longer a regional power in waiting. It was an industrial giant in motion. Railroads cut across the continent. Steel poured out of Pennsylvania. Oil reshaped global energy markets. American factories rivaled, and in some cases surpassed, British production. For the first time, Britain was forced to confront a sobering reality. The former colony was becoming a peer. This shift created tension, but it also produced something new: clarity. Britain had long treated the United States with a mixture of condescension and suspicion. That posture no longer made sense. America could not be controlled, coerced, or ignored. It had to be managed diplomatically. And crucially, Britain began to realize that America's rise did not automatically threaten the British Empire in the same way European rivals did. Germany, not America, was becoming Britain's greatest concern. German industrial growth, naval expansion, and aggressive diplomacy alarmed London. Unlike the United States, Germany sat directly in Europe, within striking distance of Britain's core interests. Slowly, Britain's strategic lens shifted. America was no longer the main what-if threat, it was a potential counterbalance. This change in British thinking coincided with a profound transformation in American foreign policy. For most of the 19th century, the United States had been consumed by internal expansion. Westward settlement, Native American displacement, and Reconstruction after the Civil War absorbed national energy. Foreign entanglements were viewed with suspicion. George Washington's warning against permanent alliances still echoed in political debates. But isolation did not mean indifference. The Monroe Doctrine, declared in 1823, had already drawn a clear line. European powers were not welcome to interfere in the Western Hemisphere. Initially, this doctrine relied heavily on British naval power for enforcement. Britain supported it not out of love for America, but because it aligned with British commercial interests and limited rival empires. It was an unspoken partnership, one neither side publicly acknowledged. By the 1890s, that partnership was tested openly. The Venezuela boundary dispute of 1895 brought Britain and America to the brink once again. The United States demanded arbitration over a border conflict between British Guiana and Venezuela. Britain initially dismissed the demand. In response, the U.S. government invoked the Monroe Doctrine and issued a sharp warning. The tone was confrontational. War was suddenly conceivable. And then Britain did something extraordinary, it conceded. Britain agreed to arbitration. This decision shocked European observers. Britain, the world's dominant imperial power, had backed down under American pressure. But the reasoning was cold and strategic. Britain did not want a war with the United States while Germany loomed as a far greater danger. Preserving peace with America mattered more than defending a distant colonial border. For Americans, the outcome was transformative. It was the moment the United States realized it could stand eye to eye with Britain and be taken seriously. For Britain, it was the moment America officially transitioned from former colony to recognized great power. After 1895, the tone between the two nations changed rapidly. Diplomatic cooperation increased. Trade deepened. Cultural connections strengthened. British elites began speaking of Anglo-Saxon kinship, a concept deeply flawed and exclusionary but influential at the time. It reframed the relationship as familial rather than adversarial. The Spanish-American War of 1898 reinforced this shift. Britain, unlike other European powers, openly supported the United States. British ports welcomed American ships. British newspapers praised American actions. This was not neutrality, it was alignment. The message was clear. Britain preferred an American-dominated Western Hemisphere to one influenced by rival European empires. By the dawn of the 20th century, Britain and America were no longer enemies in any meaningful sense. But they were not yet allies either. Their cooperation was pragmatic, not emotional. Trust existed, but it was cautious. Each nation still prioritized its own interests above all else. What would finally seal their transformation was not shared language, trade, or heritage, but a global crisis so vast that neutrality would become impossible. A war that would force both nations to choose sides, redefine power, and answer a question that had lingered since 1776. Could former enemies ever fully stand together? When the First World War erupted in 1914, Britain and the United States did not rush into each other's arms. In fact, their reactions revealed just how incomplete their transformation still was. Britain went to war immediately, bound by alliances and geography. The United States did not. Instead, it declared neutrality, just as it had in countless European conflicts before. To many Americans, Europe's wars were ancient, irrational struggles that had nothing to do with them. Britain understood this hesitation, but it also tested British patience. The war quickly became existential. Britain needed resources, loans, food, and industrial output on a scale it could not sustain alone. The United States, neutral on paper, became Britain's economic lifeline. American banks financed British war efforts. American factories produced weapons and supplies. American ships crossed dangerous waters to keep Britain alive. This imbalance created friction. Britain enforced a naval blockade against Germany, stopping neutral ships, including American ones, and inspecting their cargo. To Britain this was survival. To Americans, it looked suspiciously like the same imperial arrogance they had once fought against. The old resentment stirred. Then Germany changed everything. German submarine warfare began targeting shipping without warning. American citizens died at sea. The sinking of the Lusitania in 1915, which killed 128 Americans, shocked the United States. Britain emphasized German brutality, but American leaders remained cautious. War was still unpopular. Neutrality still felt safer. For nearly 3 years, Britain and America existed in an uncomfortable in-between space, economically intertwined, diplomatically tense, strategically aligned in practice but not in name. Britain wanted commitment. America wanted distance. The breaking point came in 1917. Germany resumed unrestricted submarine warfare and sent the Zimmermann telegram, proposing a military alliance with Mexico against the United States. The message was intercepted and shared with Washington. The threat was no longer abstract. It was direct. When the United States entered the war, it did not do so as Britain's subordinate. It entered as an independent power with its own command, its own objectives, and its own vision for the post-war world. President Woodrow Wilson spoke of making the world safe for democracy. Britain spoke of preserving balance and empire. They were fighting the same enemy but for different reasons. The cooperation that followed was real, but imperfect. American troops fought alongside British forces. Intelligence was shared. Naval coordination intensified. Yet disagreements over strategy, command, and peace terms never disappeared. Britain saw itself as the experienced guardian of global order. America saw itself as the moral reformer destined to reshape it. Victory in 1918 brought relief but not unity. At the Paris Peace Conference, these differences became unmistakable. Wilson's idealism clashed with British pragmatism. Britain wanted security and stability. America wanted transformation. The resulting treaty satisfied neither fully, and planted the seeds for future catastrophe. After the war, the United States retreated once again into isolationism. It rejected the League of Nations, a structure Wilson himself had championed. Britain was disappointed but not surprised. The alliance of wartime had not yet matured into a permanent partnership. Still, something fundamental had shifted. Britain and America had fought side by side in the greatest war the world had ever known. Trust had been tested under fire. Communication lines were established. Military cooperation had proven possible. They did not become friends overnight. But they were no longer strangers, or rivals, either. The question that remained was whether this fragile connection would survive the next storm. And that storm, unlike the first, would leave no room for hesitation, half measures, or distance. The Second World War was not just another global conflict. It was the final test of the Anglo-American relationship, the moment when every unresolved tension, every past rivalry, and every hard-earned lesson from a century of near misses was put on trial. This time, there would be no neutral middle ground powerful enough to hide behind. When war broke out in Europe in 1939, Britain once again stood alone. France would fall. Much of Europe would collapse under Nazi occupation. And once again the United States stayed officially neutral. On the surface, it looked like history repeating itself. But beneath that surface, everything was different. Franklin D. Roosevelt understood something earlier American leaders had resisted. The fate of Britain and the fate of the United States were now inseparable. A Nazi-dominated Europe would eventually threaten the Western Hemisphere. Geography could delay danger, but not prevent it. So while Congress and the public resisted direct involvement, Roosevelt quietly moved America closer to Britain than ever before. Lend-Lease was the turning point. The United States began supplying Britain with weapons, ships, food, and fuel on a scale never seen before, without immediate payment. This was not neutrality. It was strategic commitment. Britain, financially exhausted and under constant attack, survived because America chose to keep it alive. At the same time, something extraordinary was happening at the leadership level. Roosevelt and Winston Churchill did not merely cooperate, they bonded. Their correspondence was constant, candid, and deeply strategic. They argued, disagreed, joked, and planned together. The Atlantic Charter, drafted before America officially entered the war, laid out a shared vision for the post-war world: self-determination, economic cooperation, and collective security. For the first time, Britain and America were not just fighting the same enemy, they were imagining the same future. Pearl Harbor removed the last barrier. When the United States entered the war in December 1941, it did not hesitate. It committed fully. And Britain did something just as important: it accepted American leadership. This was unprecedented. The world's greatest empire acknowledged that the balance of power had shifted. The cooperation that followed was total. Intelligence sharing reached levels once unimaginable. The Manhattan Project included British scientists. Military commands were integrated. Strategies were debated intensely but executed jointly. From North Africa to Normandy, from the Battle of the Atlantic to the defeat of Nazi Germany, Britain and America functioned as a single war machine. And this time, when victory came, neither side walked away. After 1945, the British Empire began its decline, but the Anglo-American relationship did not weaken, it deepened. The Cold War created a new shared adversary. NATO institutionalized their alliance. Intelligence cooperation became permanent. Military interoperability became standard. Cultural exchange exploded. Disagreements still happened, over Suez, Vietnam, Iraq, but they happened within an unbreakable framework of partnership. So when did Britain and America stop being enemies? Not in 1783. Not in 1815. Not even in 1918. They stopped being enemies when they realized that survival, power, and global stability depended on each other more than on pride. The transformation was slow, reluctant, and often uncomfortable, but once complete, it reshaped the world. Former enemies became allies not because they forgot the past, but because they understood it. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the turning points that changed global history, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications here on NationScope. We break down the stories behind power, conflict, and the moments that quietly decide the future of nations. Until next time, stay curious and keep questioning the world around you.